Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the review and recap series for the Living Under Nazi Rule topic as part of the OCR B Schools History Project exam board. We're carrying on with our second theme in the unit, which is control and opposition between 1933 and 1939. In the last video, we looked at how the Nazis used terror to create a culture of fear within Nazi Germany and rule through fear. In this episode, we're looking at how the Nazis skillfully used propaganda to try and win hearts and minds of the German people. So we're going to explore the different ways in which they tried to do this. Firstly, they used newspapers. Newspapers were obviously the main form of spreading news at the time, and lots of newspapers existed before the Nazis came into power in 1933. So the Nazis set up a part of government called the Reich Press Chamber to control existing papers. And by 1939, they had managed to take in 2/3 of all existing newspapers under their control. They also published their own newspaper, which was called Der Stürmer, or meaning the Stormer, and it was in this newspaper that they published anti-Semitic cartoons in order to try and indoctrinate the public. Later on, they also passed the Editor's Law, which meant that editors of newspapers were responsible for all content that was published in newspapers, and this was to try and encourage newspaper editors to censor what they were saying in case anything was published that the Nazis deemed un-German or against the Nazi party. The editors would then be responsible and liable for any punishments. One of the best ways to spread messages in the 1930s was through radio, and this was because it was quick, it was easy, you didn't need to read or write, and you could convey large amounts of information relatively quickly. Again, radio companies already existed before the Nazis, so when they come into power, they set up another part of government called the Reich Radio Company to control existing radio stations. On these radio stations, they would play German folk music and promote German culture, and music such as jazz music, which was produced at the time predominantly by African Americans, was banned, and Jewish composers were also removed from the airwaves. And you would also have Hitler's speeches and Nazi speeches played over these radios as a way of conveying the Nazi message to a large audience. How did the Nazis also try and encourage ownership of radios? Well, they mass-produced a cheap, small radio called the People's Radio or the People's Receiver. It cost about a week's wages for the average worker, so it was very affordable. And this resulted in about 70% of the workforce owning one of these radio sets by 1939. So it means that the Nazis are able to spread their message very quickly to a large audience. The Nazis also tried to control film. Film is sort of emerging as a part of leisure in the 1920s and the 1930s. It's not film as we know it is today, but they were nevertheless extremely popular. So that was another aspect that the Nazis needed to control. Again, they create a part of government called the Reich Film Chamber to limit the amount of foreign films that were allowed into Germany and make it really hard to see films that were produced outside of Germany, just in case they said anything that was against the German state. And they also promoted their own German films, again, that celebrated German culture. By 1939, the Nazis are funding roughly 2/3 of all films. Again, this is to control the content of those films. And an example of a film that was published and created by the Nazis was a film called The Eternal Jew, which unsurprisingly was very anti-Semitic as a way of trying to indoctrinate anti-Semitic ideas into the audience watching. In 1934, the Reich Cinema Law meant that all scripts had to be approved before they could be published and used in films. And again, that was a way of censoring the content within scripts to make sure that nothing anti-Nazi or un-German was said. The Nazis also used rallies as a form of propaganda. A rally is kind of like a mass gathering of Nazi supporters in a specific place, and they held these every year. At these rallies, they would try and showcase the Nazi support by gathering all of these people in one place, like I've said, and they would have speeches, bands playing music, they would have parades through the city, and they would even have mock battles as well. Nuremberg was the site of many rallies, the largest of which were in 1934 and 1935 as well, but at the 1934 one, 500 trains carried 250,000 people from around Germany to Nuremberg, as a way of demonstrating the Nazi support and power. At this rally as well, there was a filmmaker called Leni Riefenstahl, who creates a film of Hitler at this rally called The Triumph of Will. And in the film, you can see Hitler descending into Nuremberg from his plane, coming out of the sky, and he's almost making him look godlike as he comes down over the people underneath him, supporting him. Okay. You also get the Berlin Olympics in 1936 are used as an example of Nazi propaganda. So in 1936, Berlin is given the Olympics, and the Nazis see this as an opportunity to demonstrate the power of Germany and the power of Nazi Germany. In preparation for this, they removed anti-Semitic posters from around the city, and instead they replaced them with swastikas. And they also built a 100,000 seat stadium, which I believe was the largest at the time, and that's a sign of the Nazi strength. The German team itself, so the Olympic German team, consisted of solely Aryan-looking competitors, and they go on to win the most gold medals. So Hitler uses this as proof, in inverted commas, of the Aryan exceptionalism, the idea that the Aryan race is physically superior to all other races on Earth. However, this is simply not true, and an exception to this rule in the eyes of Hitler is Jesse Owens, who was an African-American long jumper, who goes on to beat his German rival in the long jump, and Jesse Owens goes on to win a few more gold medals, and he was an African-American, like I've said, so that disproves Hitler's racial theory. It was a huge source of embarrassment for Hitler that a man of African-American descent is standing on the podium winning gold, beating his German competitor. Lastly, you also get posters. Posters are probably the most common form of propaganda that you'll come across either as sources or if you Google it or do any research online. And these posters would often display anti-Semitic slogans, pro-Nazi party messages as well, and they would be placed around towns and villages. And posters are increasingly used during World War II to reinforce the Nazi message and whip up support for Germany during the war. Posters are a little bit difficult to talk about if you had an exam question on propaganda, just because there's not a great deal more than you can say about that. So I would steer clear of mentioning them too much in the exam, but it's important that you know that they are a form of propaganda because they're probably the one that you'll be most familiar with already. So what's the main purpose of propaganda? Well, as I've already said, it's to win hearts and minds of the people, to indoctrinate, which means brainwash them with Nazi ideology. In the previous video, we looked at how the Nazis make sure that people toe the party line through fear. This is all about, well, how can we actually convince people to self-regulate their behaviour and become pro-Nazi without us having to punish them in any way? How can we make them think like us from the Nazi perspective? So that's the main purpose of propaganda during this time. It's up to you whether you think terror or propaganda was more effective or if it was a blend of the two. That's something that you might need to consider. But nevertheless, this wraps up the propaganda aspect of control between 1933 and 1939. Just like in the previous videos, I've drawn together some short questions that you can test your key knowledge on from the previous slide. In a minute, I'm going to flash the questions up. I would like you to pause them, and then I'll put the answers up on the screen so that you can see the correct answers. So the questions are coming up on the screen now. What I would like you to do is pause the video right now, have a go at these questions, and in about 2 seconds' time, I'm going to flash up the answers.